A single wine glass, two fingerprints, one impossible truth. Welcome to Mystery Path. I am your host, Asher Vane. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from today? Your comments make this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. I was in the middle of a sandwich. Not just any sandwich, mind you, but a triple-decker masterpiece involving prosciutto, pickled red onions, and a sharp mustard I'd liberated from Wolfe's stash. When the knock came at the front door. Twice. Pause. Then once again, more insistently. Wolfe, naturally, didn't so much as flinch upstairs in his plant palace, communing with his orchids as if they were clients with deep pockets and no fingerprints. That left me, Archie Goodwin, part-time secretary, full-time legman, and resident bouncer, to abandon my creation and answer the summons. The man on the stoop was tall, sharp-jawed, and looked like he'd been professionally dressed by someone who owned fewer emotions than Wolfe. Say, a mortician. He had one of those faces you've seen somewhere. Maybe a magazine ad for foreign sedans or a congressional scandal. Take your pick. I'm here to see Mr. Wolfe. His voice was clear and measured, like a man used to being listened to. Name? I asked, already halfway to deciding I didn't like him. Grant Halberd. I stepped aside. Come in. You get one shot, so make it dramatic. Wolfe doesn't rise for lesser matters than a world war. He walked in with too much self-control and none of the usual awe people exhibit when stepping into the brownstone, Wolfe's fortress of fact, and absolute routine. I led him to the office and offered the red leather chair as if it were part of a ritual, which, in Wolfe's world, it absolutely was. I didn't bother buzzing for Wolfe yet. I wanted to take this guy's measure first. Something about him gave me the creeps, and not in the fun, Friday night in Hell's Kitchen kind of way. I was told Mr. Wolfe takes cases, he said, adjusting the cuff of a very expensive shirt. Discreet ones. He does. Rarely. And even then, only when the fee makes him consider standing up. You want discreet. Talk quick. Grant Halberd studied me like I was a crossword puzzle with two clues missing. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a folded napkin. Not the paper kind. White linen, ironed. Wrapped inside was a wine glass. He laid it on Wolfe's desk like it was nitroglycerin. I raised a brow. You brought us a drink? Look at the glass. I did. There were two partial fingerprints. One wide and smudged, probably from a thumb. The other more delicate, with a narrow ridge pattern. You want us to lift prints? I asked. That's more up the street with the NYPD. No. He leaned forward. I want you to tell me whose they are. I leaned back. That's not how fingerprints work unless one of them belongs to Mr. Wolfe, or yours truly. And in that case, we have a much more interesting problem. Grant Halberd's jaw worked once. It's not about identification. It's about what those prints mean. I narrowed my eyes. You're going to have to do a lot better than that. He took a breath, looked around the room like he was checking for spies, and then dropped the real hook. One of the prints belongs to my wife. The other, to a man I buried last year. I didn't say anything. Neither did Wolfe, because he still hadn't been summoned. So I stared at the man, and he stared back, and the glass sat on the desk like the last piece of a puzzle we hadn't seen the box cover for. He broke first. My wife, Lorna, was a sommelier. We hosted private tastings for investors. 3 nights ago, I found this glass in our locked tasting room. 2 sets of prints, Heron and Joseph Hensley's. He let the name hang there. Joseph Hensley, he repeated, died in a fire 13 months ago. I identified his body myself. Now, even I knew that name. Hensley had been one of those quietly loud hedge fund types, the kind that made enemies by pretending they didn't know anyone else existed. His death had made ripples in the finance pages and a few conspiracy threads on the darker corners of the internet. I reached for the buzzer and pressed once. Upstairs, somewhere among the orchids, Nero Wolfe would have flinched, not from urgency, but because I'd interrupted his scheduled solitude by pressing the buzzer before noon. Halberd waited. He was good at it. Still, alert, expensive. 10 seconds later, Wolfe's voice rolled down through the hidden intercom. "Archie, what is it?" I kept my voice level. "A client with an urgent question involving a wine glass and a dead man's fingerprints." Silence. Then, "Bring him." And just like that, Nero Wolfe had accepted the case. Why? He hadn't seen the man. He hadn't examined the glass. But something about that sentence had prodded his curiosity, and with Wolfe, curiosity was currency. As we walked upstairs, Halberd said quietly, "I'm not hiring him to prove someone's alive. I'm hiring him to prove my wife didn't kill him twice." Yeah, this was going to be fun. Wolfe didn't look up when we entered the office, which wasn't unusual. He sat in his oversized chair like a Roman emperor in semi-retirement, his lips moving slightly as if finishing a thought from 3 minutes ago. The only sign that he registered our presence was the faint shifting of his eyes toward the napkin-wrapped glass in my hand. I placed it gently on the desk, unwrapped it, and stepped back. Grant Halberd stood precisely 2 feet from the red leather chair, waiting for Wolfe to tell him to sit. He didn't get the invitation immediately. Wolfe, as ever, enjoyed exercising silence the way other men wield threats. I knew better than to interrupt. Finally, after a long, almost theatrical pause, Wolfe glanced at the glass and then at Halberd. "You've brought me a wine glass," he said. "Yes," Halberd replied. "That is not in itself a crime," Wolfe said, "but you imply that it contains evidence of one. Explain." Halberd sat when Wolfe gave the faintest nod. He was composed again, back in his armor. "The fingerprints on that glass belong to my wife, Lorna, and Joseph Hensley. I'm certain of the first. The second," he hesitated, "should be impossible." Wolfe steepled his fingers under his chin. "Explain why." "I told your man, Goodwin, that Joseph Hensley died 13 months ago. His body was found in the wreckage of a house fire in Westchester. There was dental confirmation. The fire inspector ruled it accidental. The estate was closed. Everyone moved on." Wolfe gave him a small, flat stare. "Yet you believe this glass indicates otherwise?" "I found it in our private tasting room. That room is locked at all times. Only Lorna and I have keys. We hosted a private session on Tuesday for an investor. I noticed the glass when I was cleaning up Wednesday morning. We'd used Riedel Cabernet stems. This one was a Bordeaux tulip, from an old set we haven't touched in years." "You believe your wife placed it there?" Wolfe asked. "No." Halberd's eyes flicked away for the first time. "I think someone wants me to believe she did." Wolfe's brows rose slightly. That was something. "That is not a trivial distinction, Mr. Halberd." "I know. But Lorna's rattled. I asked her about it, and she claimed it wasn't hers, that she never touched that glass. But the print is there. I had a private lab confirm it matched her driver's license records." "And Hensley's?" "That lab has a partial from an old investment conference badge. Hensley spoke at an event years ago and signed in on one of those stylus-based pads. The fingerprint pattern they had was enough to confirm similarity. But here's the thing. Even if it's not definitive, the shape, arch, and loops match. Close enough to open old wounds." Wolfe leaned back slowly. And you brought this to me. Why? I don't want the police involved unless they have to be. I want to know who left that glass and why. If someone's trying to frighten us, I need to understand their angle. If Hensley is alive, he caught himself. Or if someone wants us to believe he is, I want to find out before it goes public. Indeed, Wolfe murmured. You are not worried your wife might be involved? I'm worried she's being framed. Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment. That was often a sign his interest had passed from hypothetical to tactical. He disliked messes in his own house, but he found pleasure in untangling the mental ones that others brought him. Very well, he said at last. Mr. Goodwin will visit your home and investigate the context of this glass. He will want access to the room, your wife, and anyone who has had occasion to enter your residence in the past month. Halberd gave a small, relieved nod. You'll take the case? I already have, Wolfe replied, when you walked through my door and brought something that challenges logic. When Halberd had gone, leaving the wine glass on Wolfe's desk like a riddle with no question, I poured myself a fresh coffee and leaned against the edge of the desk. Well, I said, what do you think? I think, Wolfe replied, that a dead man has no use for a Bordeaux tulip, and that if the woman touched the glass, she either lies or is unaware. If she lies, the question is why. If she's unaware, then someone's playing a game. Yes. Wolfe leaned forward and nudged the glass an inch with one thick finger. A deliberate one. You believe the husband? Not yet, but I believe the fingerprints are not accidental. I nodded. Want me to take the glass to Saul, have him do another lift? No, Wolfe said. It's better we appear uninvested. If someone is watching, they must see us proceed with cautious indifference. That'll be hard with a glass of wine and ghost fingerprints sitting in your office. He gave me a sharp look. Then take it away. I wrapped it back in the linen napkin and carried it downstairs to the safe. Wolfe hated using the thing. It implied the world had grown coarse. But when it came to subtle threats, he was all for preservation. The rest of the morning passed with irritating slowness. Wolfe didn't speak again until lunch, and that was only to complain about the vinaigrette. By 2:30, I had Halberd's address, a list of prior guests from the last 4 tasting events, and a set of keys to the building, which he'd sent over with his driver in a manila envelope labeled Confidential. Wolfe sniffed at that like it was week-old tilapia. I'll be back before dinner, I told him, sliding into my coat. Bring me people, Archie, Wolfe said. Objects are not enough. I want behavior. And remember, watch her hands. She may say more with her fingers than with her mouth. Which, coming from Wolfe, was practically romantic advice. I took the keys and headed out into the early spring rain. The Halberds lived in an apartment above a wine gallery in Soho, tucked between an antique bookstore and one of those cafes that serves lattes with philosophical quotes. The gallery itself was elegant, understated, and locked up tight. Halberd had included a note instructing me to enter through the private elevator around the back. I buzzed, was acknowledged, and the lift creaked upward with a low, mechanical sigh. The door opened into a sun-drenched loft with exposed brick and a disturbing lack of dust. The kind of place that felt like it had been arranged for a magazine shoot, not for living. Lorna Halberd stood near the window, arms folded, wearing a silk blouse the color of old champagne. Her eyes were sharper than her husband's, and less inclined to be polite. "You're Wolfe's man," she said. "I'm Archie Goodwin. You're expecting me?" "Grant said you'd be coming. He didn't say you'd be this prompt." I'm always prompt when the dead get chatty, I said, stepping in. She didn't smile, just tilted her head and gestured toward the hallway. The tasting room is this way. You can poke around all you like. I assume you're looking for ghosts? Only the ones with keys, I said, and fingerprints. She turned then and walked away, and I followed. I was already watching her hands. Wolfe was right. People always talk with their fingers, especially when they think their mouth is doing all the lying. And this case had just begun to smell like someone poured an old vintage over a pile of matches and waited to see who'd light it. The tasting room was tucked at the end of a long hallway, the kind lined with framed black and white wine labels and still lifes of grapes that had never seen a supermarket. The walls were deep plum, the lighting subdued and curated, like every inch had been adjusted for mood. Lorna unlocked the double doors with a soft click and stepped aside, letting me in first. The room was colder than I expected, chilled slightly more than necessary for wine. A long walnut table ran down the center, flanked by 12 high-backed chairs. Everything was symmetrical, too clean, almost rehearsed. Racks of wine stood on each side, recessed into the walls. At the far end sat a narrow sideboard, polished to a mirror sheen, with a single empty glass resting at the edge. Not the one from Wolfe's desk. This one was identical, but clean. It sat like a placeholder in a ceremony no one attended. That's where it was, Lorna said. Right there. I hadn't seen it before. We don't use that shape for clients anymore. I walked over and crouched beside the sideboard, careful not to touch anything. You didn't set it down, not even by accident? I told Grant the same thing. Her voice was flat, but not defensive. That glass wasn't from Tuesday's tasting. I clear every table myself afterward. This room is locked between uses. The cleaning crew doesn't even enter. Anyone else have a key? I asked. Only Grant and I. It's always been the rule. I walked slowly back toward the center table, scanning the room for disturbances. Nothing obvious. No scratches on the floor. No smudges on the polished surface. No wine rings where someone might have rested a forgotten glass. But the place had that too perfect feeling. The kind that makes a guy like me wonder if it's been cleaned because something happened. What was the last wine served in here? I asked. We poured a 2010 Chateau Pavis de Cesse and a Barolo, she said, not missing a beat. The client was fussy, said he preferred reds with fewer emotional overtones. That's a new one, I muttered. He was new, money, trying to sound like old. She turned and leaned lightly against the wall, arms still crossed. I told him terroir doesn't cater to therapy. I let that one go. You remember which glasses you used? Ria del Vinum, Cabernet Set, 6 in total. I keep them separate from the old styles. That tulip glass, her mouth tightened slightly. That doesn't belong here anymore. It hasn't been used in years. But it belonged to the house. Yes, part of a discontinued set. Grant bought them early in our marriage. The rest are in storage, boxed. Can I see them? She didn't blink. Of course. Follow me. She led me down a back hall that branched into a smaller service corridor. A utility closet opened into a neatly organized storage room with labeled boxes stacked shoulder high. She moved directly to the third row and pulled down a box marked Vintage Stems. Tulip Bordeaux, Grant. Inside, 7 glasses sat in foam cradles. One slot was empty. So one of these went missing. That's what I tried to explain to Grant. She looked down at the box. That slot's been empty for over a year. The set was never full after Hensley died. I felt something prick the back of my neck. You're saying one of these glasses disappeared after Hensley died? She nodded. We assumed it was broken. We used to host dinners with him. He was a family friend. The night before the fire, he was at our house. We drank a Bordeaux. It might have been that glass. I don't remember exactly. But after the fire, the set was never whole again. You didn't mention that to Grant? Number why would I? He wouldn't remember. He's not sentimental about glassware. I watched her for a moment. She was being careful, not cagey. There's a difference. Her hands stayed at her sides, her voice level. She wasn't acting like someone who'd planted evidence. She was acting like someone terrified they were being watched. Do you think Hensley's alive? I asked finally. No. Her eyes locked onto mine. I think someone wants to resurrect him. Why? She exhaled slowly. Because Grant inherited his seat on the Averill board after Hensley died. And not everyone was happy about that. Averill Capital. The name clicked. I'd seen it in the finance columns the way you see sharks in documentaries, only mildly interested until one swims too close. Hensley had been one of their darlings. If Halberd inherited his place, someone might think the wrong man had survived the fire. Who else would have reason to stir up ghosts? She hesitated. Then, two people. Genevieve Maris and Conrad Vale. Both were close to Joseph, and both resented Grant. Genevieve was Joseph's protege, and she believed the board should have appointed her. Conrad ran compliance, quiet, but loyal to Joseph in a way that felt personal. Any of them ever been here? She nodded. Conrad came to one tasting months ago. Genevieve hasn't. She avoids anything personal. Could they have gotten a key? No, she said, but this time with less certainty. Not unless someone copied it, which would require opportunity. Which, of course, is where I come in. Do you mind if I poke around the kitchen and pantry area? I asked. Help yourself. The kitchen was stainless steel sleek, the kind of space that only looks casual. The pantry was cooler, even more precise. Row after row of sealed wine, spices, and enough imported ingredients to bankrupt a French restaurant. It took me 10 minutes to catalog everything worth noticing, and 3 minutes to find what Wolfe would call the incongruity. A bottle of Amarone, half empty, sitting behind a row of unopened Rieslings. It was poorly concealed. Someone who didn't know the layout had probably moved it. The cork had been jammed back in without finesse. I lifted it carefully and caught the faintest print. Oily, fresh. I wrapped it in my handkerchief and tucked it into my satchel. Wolfe would want to see it. When I returned to the tasting room, Lorna was by the window, watching the street. Does anyone come here unannounced? I asked. Sometimes. The gallery downstairs keeps odd hours. Some guests find their way up if they're persistent. And do you ever entertain alone? She turned. Not since Joseph. That line landed like a dropped decanter. I didn't press it. Back outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and the air smelling of cold cement and expensive cologne from the gallery doorman. I filed my notes in my head, double-checked the timeline, and caught a cab uptown. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was already seated in the office, hands folded, eyes half shut. Fritz had brought in tea. Wolfe hated tea. You have something, he said, not opening his eyes. I placed the bottle on the desk. A wine glass is one thing, I said. But this wasn't supposed to be found. He reached for it slowly. You suspect sabotage? More like sleight of hand. Whoever's behind this wants to blur the lines between the past and the present. They want Halberd confused, and Lorna doubting herself. Wolfe grunted. That is not difficult, with a ghost and a fingerprint as tools. There's more, I added. 2 names, Genevieve Maris and Conrad Vale, both tied to Hensley. Both had reason to dislike Halberd. He gave me a thin smile. Excellent. Then it is time we began inviting ghosts to tea. And just like that, the game had changed. Wolfe didn't need to leave his chair. He had suspects. He had motive. And he had me. Which meant the storm was about to start, right here in the brownstone. The next morning began with Wolfe lecturing me on the crime of ordering smoked haddock without prior consultation. Fritz had made it anyway, bless him, and I'd eaten it anyway, also bless me, which left Wolfe irritable but intellectually alert, his preferred state for accepting the unexpected. I took advantage of the mood. Genevieve Maris first, I asked, sipping my second cup of coffee. Wolfe nodded without looking at me. He was reading a dossier I'd assembled at midnight. A thin one, but with enough flavor to stir his appetite. She's the one with a resume built on proximity to brilliance. Hensley called her his executive conscience. Got passed over for the board seat Halberd now occupies. Sharp, precise, very private. She didn't contest the appointment publicly, but sources say she threatened to resign. Wolfe grunted. And yet she remained. Correct. She stayed, quietly, which might mean she had a longer game in mind. She is unmarried? Single, early 40s, no siblings, lives alone, apartment on the Upper East, not flashy. She drinks? According to 2 bar owners and 1 wine blogger, yes, but never excessively, and always red. Wolfe sighed and put down the folder. Then invite her. I raised an eyebrow. Here? Of course. There's no substitute for posture. Have her come at 3. And Conrad Vale? Not yet. Let us first assess the candor of Miss Maris. You will, however, confirm Vale's availability, should I require him, tomorrow. That's how my day began. Herding a reluctant executive into a lion's den, with nothing but charm and a lightly veiled threat of scandal to get her moving. Genevieve Maris arrived precisely at 3. Not early, not late. Her coat was gray, her shoes black, and her lipstick that exact shade of red that looks accidental but isn't. She greeted me like she already knew me, but had decided not to bother remembering my name. You're the one who makes phone calls sound like subpoenas, she said as I took her coat. I try to strike a professional tone, I replied. This way. Wolfe, by contrast, greeted her with nothing more than a nod. He was seated as usual, fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded, face a marble slab of disinterest. She didn't blink. She sat when I gestured and crossed one leg over the other, like a metronome had told her to. Miss Maris, Wolfe said without introduction. You knew Joseph Hensley? I worked with him, yes. You were close? We had a good rapport. Do you believe he's dead? Her eyes flicked to mine for the briefest second, then back to Wolfe. I do. You attended the memorial? I planned it. Did you see the body? No. She paused. His wife did. Grant Halberd did. The coroner confirmed it. I saw the photos. And now, Wolfe said softly, you're being asked to believe he may not be dead. Her face didn't change. That's ridiculous. Wolfe gestured toward the wrapped glass sitting quietly on his desk. Yet his fingerprints have resurfaced, on a wine glass. In the possession of Lorna Halberd, Genevieve Maris, stared at the object, then back at Wolfe. I don't know what that means, she said calmly. It means, Wolfe replied, that someone has gone to some effort to unsettle the Halberds, to suggest deceit, or resurrection. Resurrection is the stuff of tabloids. Indeed, Wolfe murmured. which is why I find your continued presence at Averill Capital curious. She blinked, just once. I stayed, she said slowly, because someone needed to manage the chaos. Halberd is unfit. He's careless. Joseph's absence left a power vacuum. Why not seize that power? She smiled faintly. Because the board likes calm hands, not grasping ones. I leaned in slightly. Did you ever visit the Halberds' home? No. Attend a tasting? No. Ever drink from a tulip glass? That got a twitch, barely perceptible. Not to my recollection. Miss Maris, Wolfe said. I find that difficult to believe. She said nothing. Perhaps you forget, Wolfe continued, but Lorna Halberd remembers you. Another blink. She does not accuse you, but she names you, as a woman with reason, with proximity to Hensley, with a motive. I had no reason to frighten them. You had reason, Wolfe said. You merely lacked proof. Genevieve Maris's lips pressed together. May I ask what you think I've done? You may, Wolfe said, but I will not answer. I coughed. Miss Maris, have you ever seen the Halberds' tasting room? No. Would you be willing to? Why? Because if you're being framed, someone is working very hard to implicate you without your knowledge. And if you're not being framed, you've already been there. She rose, smoothly, deliberately. I have nothing to hide, but I won't be dragged into a game of suggestion. I had nothing to do with Hensley's death, or his glassware. She turned to leave. Miss Maris, Wolfe said. One last question. She paused. Do you believe Joseph Hensley died in that fire alone? She didn't answer. But her silence was not uncertainty. It was calculation. She left without a word. When the door closed, Wolfe reached for his beer. She is intelligent, he said, and frightened. She's not talking. Number. Because she's not certain how deep this goes. Someone is pulling strings. She fears she might be holding one of them. Do you believe her? I believe, Wolfe said, that she knows more than she intends to tell. I got up to stretch. So, who's next? Conrad Vale. I nodded. Want me to bring him in? Number, go to him. Wolfe reached for a fresh notebook from the drawer. That, for Wolfe, was a declaration of war. Let him speak freely. Let him believe you are on his side. And Archie? Yes? Watch his hands. If they're clean, he's lying. I made the call before dinner. Vale agreed to meet the next morning at his office. Quiet, neutral ground. I had a feeling that was where the temperature would start to rise. Back in the kitchen, Fritz was plating duck with spiced pears. Wolfe was still in the office, composing his thoughts with the same meticulous order he applied to food and justice. I cleared my throat and leaned in the doorway. Anything you want to add before tomorrow? Yes, Wolfe said, not looking up. If Mr. Vale offers you wine, do not drink it. Why? Because if Hensley's ghost is walking, it likely poured something first. And that, I figured, was as close as Wolfe would get to superstition or strategy. Either way, the next move was mine. Conrad Vale's office was a modest, glass-fronted box perched on the 12th floor of a midtown building that smelled faintly of air conditioning and aged linoleum. It wasn't the kind of place you expect to find intrigue, but then again, that was probably the point. Vale was the head of compliance at Averill Capital, and if you know anything about finance, you know that compliance officers are hired to look like they don't cause trouble. Or notice it. He greeted me with a dry smile and an outstretched hand that was cool and dry. Too dry, maybe, like it had been wiped just before I came in. He was in his early 50s, neat hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a pinstriped suit that whispered caution rather than shouted power. Mr. Goodwin, he said, I appreciate your reaching out. Your call was pointed. I gave him my best smile. I try to leave an impression. Wolfe prefers clarity over charm. And you prefer a mix. Only when it gets results. I accepted the handshake, but watched the way he recoiled after contact. Not fear, but care. A man aware of fingerprints, perhaps. He gestured toward a chair by a small round table. No desk between us. Strategic. Coffee? He asked. No thanks. Wolfe says I'm dangerous enough uncaffeinated. He didn't smile. Not really. Just nodded and sat, crossing one leg with the ease of someone used to interviews, audits, and quiet legal threats. So, he said, we're talking about Joseph. That's right. I assume this has to do with Grant and Lorna, the glass, the speculation, what would you call it, phantom print? I raised an eyebrow. Word gets around. He shrugged. Averill Capital is a small empire with a loud rumor mill. I leaned forward. You were close to Hensley? I worked for him. He trusted me. I managed internal investigations, compliance protocols, legal disputes. We spent hours together each week. He was decisive, brilliant, ruthless when needed, but not cruel. And Grant Halberd? Vale's smile tightened. He is less decisive, not brilliant, but he plays the board well, and he married into a family with connections. That counts. You don't sound impressed. I'm not paid to be impressed, Mr. Goodwin. I'm paid to notice discrepancies, and Halberd is a walking one. Interesting you say that, I replied, because someone is trying to make him feel haunted. Vale cocked his head slightly. Haunted? A wine glass, a fingerprint, Hensley's, in Halberd's home. You didn't know? He said nothing for a moment. Then, I'd heard the rumors, but I hadn't heard confirmation. Now you have. His fingers moved, tapping lightly on his knee, rhythmic, calculated. I don't believe Joseph's alive, he said slowly. But someone might want others to believe it. Why? Because it destabilizes Halberd and the firm. You say that like it's a good thing. I say it like it's a fact. Whether it's good or not depends on who benefits. You? He looked at me, sharp now. You don't strike me as careless, Mr. Goodwin. Don't pretend I'm that obvious. Fair enough, I said. But let's be clear. If someone planted that glass, it was someone with knowledge of Halberd's home, of Hensley's habits, and of the kinds of details Wolfe finds interesting. Vale didn't flinch. You think I planted it? I think you know who could have. Silence again. Then, Genevieve. Why her? She adored Joseph, professionally, maybe more. She hid it well, but it was there. She was furious when Halberd was elevated. She called it nepotism. Was it? Yes, he said flatly, but also legal. The board plays its favorites. So you think Genevieve wants revenge? I think she wants restoration. She believes Joseph was building something grand, and Halberd diluted it. She wouldn't admit it, but she's capable of precision. She knows how to wound quietly. You're describing yourself, I said. He gave a thin smile. That's why I see it. I stood and walked to the window. The city looked as it always does from 12 stories up, humming, disinterested, and slightly smudged. Below, a courier darted between cabs, and a dog walker tried to untangle 5 leashes. She says you came to the Halberds once, I said, still facing the window. I did. A charity event. 5 months ago, I stayed 20 minutes. Did you drink? Water? Any chance you handled one of the old tulip glasses? Number. They weren't in use. I remember that. You remember the glassware? I'm compliance, he said. I remember details that no one else thinks matter. I turned. You're meticulous. and careful, so if someone planted that glass, you'd notice. Yes. So, who else could have done it? Vale hesitated. His legs stopped moving. If not Genevieve, then perhaps someone with access to records, internal logs, key copies, someone trying to frame her or both of them. Someone inside the company? Possibly. Someone who thinks Joseph's death left more questions than answers? He looked up at me. Joseph had secrets. Everyone in our world does. He had affairs, financial side paths, quiet holdings. People don't just die in fires anymore, Mr. Goodwin. They vanish when it's convenient. That was something. Convenient for whom? I don't know. But it wasn't convenient for me. Or for Genevieve. I nodded slowly. Do you want Halbert gone? I want the truth, he said. Because if Joseph was alive, he'd destroy the firm. No. He stood. He'd take it back. That was the most honest thing he'd said all day. I left shortly after, thanked him for his time, and walked 2 blocks before calling Wolfe from a payphone near a bakery that sold coffee to cops and donuts to everyone else. He's not guilty, I said. But he's involved. How? He's holding a fuse, I said. But he doesn't know if it's been lit. Come home, Wolfe said. Bring that fuse with you. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe had already begun arranging the pieces. He had notes, names, and a short list of questions that smelled like an ambush. Saul Panzer had been called. Fred Durkin, too. The circle of suspects was shrinking, but the fire that burned Joseph Hensley hadn't gone out. It had simply changed fuel. Tomorrow, Wolfe would begin the final arrangement. The chairs, the faces, the lies, lined up like vintage bottles, waiting for someone to pop the cork and spill everything. And when that happened, Wolfe would be ready. Still seated, still silent, but holding the match that would light it all. By 8 the next morning, the brownstone was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage. Wolfe had spent the early hours, for him, anything before 10 qualifies, refining the list of guests, sharpening the questions he'd deliver not as queries, but as scalpels. Fritz, who normally grumbled about sudden visitors disrupting lunch, had resigned himself to silent preparation. He knew what was coming. So did I. Saul Panzer arrived first. He came in through the back, as usual, carrying 2 folders and wearing that soft expression of someone who could tail a man through midtown traffic without breaking a sweat. He nodded to me, handed over the thinner folder, and said, 2 interesting things. Just 2? I asked. You're slipping. He didn't bother with a comeback. Saul's idea of bragging was silence. The first folder held security access logs from the Halberds Gallery building. Apparently, Saul had talked his way into the system with the ease of a locksmith at a cardboard door. The logs showed a quiet anomaly. A badge registered to a now-defunct cleaning company had accessed the Halberds floor twice in the past month, both times late at night, and both times when the gallery was officially closed. I flipped the pages. Who was the cleaner? Doesn't exist. The company dissolved 3 years ago. The badge shouldn't still be active. Let me guess. The only person who ever used it is 5'10", dark coat, hat pulled low, and managed to avoid every camera. Saul smiled faintly. Something like that. Okay, I said. What's the second thing? He tapped the thinner folder. I followed Genevieve Maris after she left here. You think she suspected us? She's too smart not to. And? She went to a safety deposit vault in Tribeca, was inside for 12 minutes, left with a slim envelope, put it in her coat, then went straight to her apartment. She hasn't left since. I leaned back and rubbed my jaw. She's sitting on something. Documents? Or a letter? From Hensley? Maybe. Wolfe, seated and immobile behind his desk, finally lifted a hand. That will do, Saul. Thank you. Panzer nodded, departed through the rear hall like a polite shadow, and left me staring at Wolfe, who now looked like a man sharpening a knife he didn't need to hold. You think she's trying to protect Hensley's memory? I asked. No, Wolfe said. I think she's trying to protect herself from what his memory has become. We didn't speak for several minutes. Wolfe hated unnecessary speculation. He preferred evidence served like a platter, neatly arranged, just heated enough to release the scent. I watched him as he read through Saul's summary again, this time slower, his mouth tightening only slightly. Fred? I asked. He's at the tasting room, Wolfe replied. He is to confirm that only 2 fingerprints are on the wine glass. If a third appears, the case becomes irrelevant. You think the glass was tampered with later? I think, Wolfe said, that people forget fingerprints are social. If 3 are present, someone passed the glass, which would suggest staging. And if only 2? Then someone knew what they were doing, which is worse. I nodded. So, when do we summon the suspects? Tonight, Wolfe said. Tonight? Yes. You never hold gatherings after sundown? I do now. That was it. That was Wolfe's version of urgency. No drama, just a shifted rule. By noon, the invitations had been sent. Formal, cryptic, impossible to ignore. I worded them carefully. Mr. Nero Wolfe requests your presence at 7:30 p.m. for a matter concerning the legacy of Joseph Hensley. No mention of fingerprints. No mention of wine. Just legacy. That would sting enough. Genevieve Maris replied through her assistant. She would attend. Conrad Vale responded personally. I'm curious, he'd said on the phone. Curious to know whether ghosts get chairs. Lorna Halberd answered via text. Of course I'll come. I want this over. Grant said only, we'll be there. I could hear the tension through the period. I spent the rest of the afternoon rearranging the office seating like a man setting traps. Wolfe directed every inch from his chair. Lorna would sit left of center, Grant to her, right. Maris on the opposite side, where Wolfe could observe her fingers. Vale at the far end, closest to me. Each had a view of the others. Each would be forced to look someone in the eye. By 7:20, the brownstone was quiet, trimmed, and prepped like a battlefield dressed as a parlor. Wolfe remained in his chair, reading a battered copy of Agriculture in the Roman Republic. But I knew better than to mistake that for disengagement. His brain was moving faster than any of ours. At 7:27, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find the Halberds. Lorna wore a navy wrap. Grant looked like a man walking into his own execution, but pretending it was a cocktail party. I took their coats and led them in. 3 minutes later, Genevieve arrived. Alone. She nodded once, declined water, and took her seat with the stillness of a woman entering a surgical theater. Vale followed shortly after. No coat, no folder. Just a quiet nod and a flick of his eyes that registered every seat in the room before he sat down. Wolfe waited until they were all still. Then he looked up. Thank you for coming, he said, his voice a calm, steady hammer. This is not a legal proceeding. I am not the police. I am a man who dislikes mysteries involving wine, death, and personal affront. He paused. You are all here because your lives intersected with Joseph Hensley. You are also here because his absence, presumed permanent, has been challenged. He gestured slightly, and I stepped forward, unwrapping the wine glass. It rested on a velvet pad, shimmering faintly under the light. 2 fingerprints visible, one delicate, one broader. This glass, Wolfe continued, was found in a locked room. It bears the fingerprints of Lorna Halbert and Joseph Hensley. Gasps are rare in our office, but I got one. From Vale. Wolfe let the silence expand like dough rising. Then, I do not believe Mr. Hensley is alive, but I do believe someone wanted us to ask that question. He turned his gaze to Maris. Miss Maris, you visited a safety deposit vault yesterday. She stiffened. You retrieved a letter. I would like to know its contents. Aye, she faltered. Then, recovering, I didn't think it was relevant. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. Then it is. She reached into her bag, slowly, and removed a cream envelope. Joseph wrote it a month before the fire. It's addressed to me. I never opened it until yesterday. Wolfe nodded. Archie. I took the letter, opened it carefully, and read it aloud. It was short, terse. Genevieve, if something happens, know this. I suspect Vale is preparing something. I don't trust him with the Avril assets. If I disappear, make noise. Don't let him bury me. There was no signature, just a dash. The room stilled. Wolfe looked at Vale. Would you like to respond? Vale exhaled through his nose. Joseph was paranoid. He thought succession planning was a threat. Did you plant the glass? No. Did you frame Genevieve? No. Wolfe turned to Lorna. Did you touch the glass? She shook her head, not knowingly. Then, Wolfe said, someone placed it there using prints collected earlier, perhaps from another glass, perhaps from a surface, and affixed them to create this illusion. Who? Grant asked. Why? That, Wolfe said, is tomorrow's answer. He stood, actually stood. Tonight, you will all go home knowing that someone here tried to rewrite the past, and tomorrow we will restore it. Then he sat again. The room emptied slowly, like air leaving a chamber. Only Wolfe remained entirely composed. I looked at him. You stood, I said. I did, he replied. So tomorrow, Wolfe said. Someone will wish they hadn't handed me a wine glass. The next morning broke with a kind of quiet that doesn't belong to any ordinary day. It was the kind of stillness that comes just before something falls, whether it's an apple or a person. Wolfe didn't speak through breakfast. Fritz, sensing the tension, served our plates with minimal flair. I'd seen this mood before. Wolfe wasn't thinking, he was arranging, internally. Not the facts, the finale. At 10 o'clock sharp, he looked up from his eggs, dabbed his mouth with a napkin, and said, Bring Miss Maris. I didn't ask why. I made the call, and she arrived an hour later, her coat slung over one arm, face composed but hollow around the eyes. I took her to the office, offered her tea, which she declined, and stepped aside as Wolfe turned toward her. You read the letter, he said. She nodded. Twice. You believe it? I want to, she said. But Joseph had suspicions about everyone. Even me, especially near the end. Wolfe studied her a moment. Miss Maris, why did Joseph trust you with that letter? Because he knew I wouldn't panic. That's not trust, Wolfe murmured. That's strategy. He expected a response. She said nothing. I believe, Wolfe went on, that Joseph Hensley wrote multiple letters. Yours was one. Vale may have received another. She blinked. You think Joseph staged his own death? I think he staged a shadow, Wolfe said. Not his death, but what followed it. He gestured toward me, and I took that as my cue. After last night, I said, we had Fred go back through the Halberds building. Checked basement storage, forgotten wine crates, even service ducts. Found nothing useful. Wolfe raised one finger. Except. I stepped forward and placed a small plastic evidence bag on the desk. Inside, a cork. Maris looked at it, puzzled. What is that? A cork pulled from a bottle of 2010 Chateau Pavis d'Essesse, found lodged behind a wine rack in the tasting room. Not part of the Halberds' current stock, not something they serve anymore, and more importantly, I held up another bag, this one with a tiny scrap of paper, a fragment of a receipt, dated 2 weeks ago, signed with initials J.H. She stared at the bag. That's not possible. Miss Maris, Wolfe said, when was the last time you heard from Joseph? A call, an email, anything. She hesitated. A week before the fire, he said he'd uncovered something that had involved Grant and Conrad. He didn't elaborate. Wolfe nodded slightly. You didn't press him? He said he'd tell me everything at dinner the following night. That night was the fire. Convenient, Wolfe said. I leaned forward. Genevieve, listen carefully. If Joseph staged something, anything, we need to know why. Was he hiding, trying to trap someone, or trying to protect you? She looked down at her hands. If Joseph planned this, he didn't trust anyone. Not even you? No, she whispered. Especially not me. Wolfe said nothing for a long time. Then, you may go. After she left, I sat across from Wolfe and waited. I didn't have to wait long. She's telling the truth, he said. She didn't plant the glass. No. Vale? No. I blinked. Then who? Wolfe looked at me. The person who had access, motive, and a silence that means survival. Lorna Halberd. I stared at him. You think she planted it? I think she didn't need to. I think she preserved it. He stood again, second time in 2 days, and walked to the bookcase. Ran his finger along the spine of a botanical volume like he was counting breath. She knew Joseph was alive, he said, or had reason to suspect. She may have helped him disappear, or, more likely, he left something for her. The glass, the bottle, a message in the only language she still trusted, wine. I frowned. Why not go to the police? Because the glass didn't accuse her. It accused everyone else, and that protected her. Wolfe turned. Get her back. Lorna returned by 4. She came alone this time. No coat, no Grant. Just herself, thinner than yesterday, and quieter. She sat when I gestured, eyes on Wolfe. I want this over, she said. It is, Wolfe replied. But you must answer one thing. She waited. When did you last see Joseph Hensley? The stillness that followed was so long, I thought maybe she wouldn't answer. Then, 6 months ago. I didn't breathe. He called me, she said, voice thin. Said he was alive. Said he'd gone underground. That something was coming for him. Something in the company. He asked for one thing. One final thing. The glass, Wolfe said. She nodded. And the bottle. He said I'd know when to leave them. Wolfe's voice was gentle now, nearly respectful. Why not tell your husband? He would have gone to the board, or worse, the press. Joseph said it had to be quiet. That noise would kill him. I asked, do you believe he's still alive? I did, until the glass turned up. She looked at Wolfe. That wasn't me. Someone found what I hid, and they used it. To scare Grant? I said. No, she replied. To test me. Wolfe's eyes closed briefly. And you passed. She stared at her hands. Joseph said that if anyone found the glass, it meant someone close had betrayed him. Someone in the circle. That's all he told me. I nodded. You didn't touch it after hiding it? Number 9 left it there behind the cabinet. Someone brought it out. Wolfe said softly. Your husband? No, she said. Grant wouldn't know where to look. Then someone else found it while searching, I said. Someone who wanted to appear innocent. Someone looking for a clue. but didn't know it was a clue. Wolfe leaned back. Conrad Vale. She nodded once. It fit. Vale, meticulous. Vale, investigating Grant. Vale, cleaning quietly. And Vale, who might have discovered the glass while snooping, then placed it back out of confusion or guilt or as a test of his own. Wolfe let out a slow breath. Then we are finished. She stood. Will you expose Joseph? No, Wolfe said. Let the dead keep their fiction. The living have enough to answer for. When she left, I looked at Wolfe. Do you believe he's still alive? I believe, Wolfe said, that Hensley orchestrated a disappearance and underestimated how clever the people he left behind were. So what now? We watch, Wolfe said. And if the wine glass ever reappears, we follow the hand that sets it down. And with that, he turned to the dinner menu, as if all we'd unraveled was a knot in a napkin. But I knew Wolfe, and I knew this wasn't over. It never is. Not when the glass is half full and the man who drank from it still hasn't sent the bill. Dinner that night passed with the deliberate quiet Wolfe demands when his mind is still walking through shadows. He ate in silence, eyes narrowed at the trout as if it were keeping secrets. I didn't interrupt. When Wolfe dined like that, chewing but not tasting, it meant the case hadn't fully settled in his mind. And if it hadn't settled in his, then it sure as hell hadn't in mine. It was past 9 when I finally said, We've got a dead man who might be alive, a wine glass nobody's supposed to touch, and 4 people who all know just enough to ruin each other. If this was supposed to end with the reveal, I missed the drum roll. Wolfe didn't glance up. It hasn't ended. It has simply shifted. To what? To stewardship, he said, setting down his fork. Of perception. Someone is now responsible for the myth of Joseph Hensley. Whether he's alive or not no longer matters as much as who controls the story. I leaned back in my chair. You think someone wants to own the illusion? Indeed. An illusion can be as valuable as a fact, especially in finance. Especially when ghosts speak louder than lawyers. I stared at him. So who takes over the illusion? Vale? Maris? Lorna? He didn't answer. But he also didn't say none of them, which told me Wolfe had an answer and he wasn't ready to share it. I cleaned up the office myself that night. The velvet pad with the wine glass had been removed, locked away again in Wolfe's safe. He wouldn't destroy it. He respected evidence, even when it was more symbolic than legal. But I noticed something else as I was straightening the desk. Wolfe's orchid scissors were missing from the tray beside his blotter. Now, that may sound like nothing, but I've worked for Wolfe long enough to know that nothing in this house is ever missing without his consent. The scissors always rest in their silver stand by 10 every night. He trims exactly 3 blossoms each evening. Ritual, routine, reflex. And they were gone. At 11, Wolfe emerged from the plant rooms upstairs. His eyes were sharper now, rested, not physically, but mentally. He stood in the office doorway, drying his hands on a linen cloth. Tomorrow, he said, you will visit Genevieve Maris. I tilted my head. Just a social call? She will offer you tea, he said. Decline. That's oddly specific. Observe the kitchen, Wolfe said. The sink in particular, look for wine residue, fresh, no more than 48 hours old. Because she received someone, unexpected, and shared a bottle not meant for guests. I exhaled. Hensley. Wolfe's mouth pressed into something not quite a smile. Perhaps. Or someone claiming to be him. That did it. I stood. You think she saw him? I think, Wolfe said. She saw enough to believe again. And that belief may now be for sale. The next morning, I arrived at Maris's apartment just after 10. She opened the door herself, already dressed for a meeting that might or might not be real. Dark blouse, pearl buttons, expression unreadable. She didn't seem surprised to see me. That was expected. "Mr. Goodwin," she said. "I assume Wolfe sent you?" "He doesn't like to leave things unfinished," I said, stepping inside. She offered me tea. I declined politely. She didn't press. The apartment was sharp, clean, expensive, but with one exception: the faint aroma of red wine. Not strong, not obvious. But there, lingering just above the citrus-scented polish. She gestured toward the sitting area. "I assume you're not here for small talk." "Not usually," I said. "But I do enjoy a good surprise, like, say, an unplanned visitor." She met my eyes, steady. "You think I've been hiding someone?" "Not hiding, maybe protecting, or maybe just listening." She didn't deny it. I stood slowly and moved toward the kitchen. "Mind if I look?" She didn't stop me. The sink was empty, wiped clean. But the drying rack had a single-stemmed glass, upside down. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The shape was unmistakable. "Bordeaux tulip," I said. Again. Genevieve walked in behind me. It was mine. "Alone?" "Yes." "You sure?" Her silence was enough. Not confirmation, not denial. Just the kind of pause that means someone's balancing hope and fear on the tip of their tongue. "When?" I asked. She said nothing. "Genevieve," I said gently, "if you saw Joseph, if you really saw him, you're now carrying a story that half the board would kill to control." She turned away. "He told me not to say anything." "Did he ask you to help him?" She hesitated. Then, "No. He asked me to forget him." I blinked. "That doesn't sound like Joseph." "No," she whispered. "But it sounded like someone who used to be Joseph." I stepped closer. "Do you think it was him?" "I did," she said. "For an hour. Then I wasn't sure." That shook me. Was he different? He was older, tired. He had a beard. A voice that cracked when he said my name. He didn't stay. He said the wine was the last favor, that I could pour it alone or share it with someone who deserved it. I swallowed. "Did you?" She looked at the rack. I poured half, then poured the rest down the sink. "What did he want?" "To vanish properly," she said. "To stop being a shadow." But he also said something strange. "What?" She turned. He said, "They'll only believe what you proved last." I nodded slowly. "Wolfe will want to hear that." "I know." I left her there, standing in her kitchen beside an empty glass and a pile of memories that might have been real. On the cab ride back, I tried to puzzle out what Wolfe had already pieced together. He hadn't stood twice in 2 days just to chase a ghost. And he hadn't asked me to check the sink unless he knew what he'd find. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was already in the office. The scissors were back in their stand, restored, as if a ritual had been resumed. I walked in and said, "She saw him." He didn't look up. "Did she prove it?" "No." "Then it doesn't matter." I crossed my arms. "That's cold even for you." "No, Archie," Wolfe said. "That's precise. Truth is not what people claim. It's what they repeat. And Miss Maris now carries a version of Joseph that may suit someone else better than the original ever did." I sat. "So, what happens now?" "Nothing," Wolfe said, "unless Joseph wishes otherwise. But the moment he speaks again, or someone else speaks for him, we will be prepared." "And the wine glass?" Wolfe smiled faintly. "Has done its job." He reached for the newspaper, folded it in half, and said, "Archie, would you mind checking the condition of the orchids before lunch?" That was Wolfe's version of closure. But I wasn't fooled. The wine had been poured. The glass had been lifted. And somewhere out there, a man either long dead or barely living had just reminded us that ghosts don't haunt the living. They direct them. That night, the brownstone hummed with a quiet so dense it felt staged. Fritz moved through the kitchen like a man trying not to be noticed. Even the clink of plates was subdued, as if the walls themselves knew Wolfe was waiting. Not for answers, but for the moment when answers became irrelevant. I lingered in the office after dinner, watching Wolfe's face as he read the final page of the transcript I'd typed up from my visit to Genevieve Maris. He didn't speak right away. He rarely did when he was at the threshold of something, that peculiar edge where knowing meets deciding. Then he set the page down, interlaced his fingers, and looked at me. "She saw him," he said. "You believe her now?" "I believe she believes it. That will suffice." I leaned forward. "So, what does that make Joseph Hensley now? A fugitive? A myth?" Wolfe's lips pressed into a line. "A myth with utility." "For whom?" "For whoever picks up where he left off." "And who would that be?" Wolfe reached toward his beer without answering. The pause stretched. He took a slow sip, wiped his mouth, and said, "Tomorrow morning, you will meet with Grant Halberd." I blinked. "What for?" "To offer him something he's not expecting." "Which is?" "Control." The word sat there between us like a dropped pin. I tilted my head. "You're going to give him the myth?" "I am going to offer him the burden of it," Wolfe said. "The appearance of certainty, which is, in these circles, far more valuable than truth." "You think he'll take it?" "He will," Wolfe said, "because it's the only way he wins." The next morning was gray and windless. I met Grant Halberd at a private coffee shop near Lincoln Square. He arrived 10 minutes early, which was enough to confirm he was anxious. Dressed in dark navy, jaw clenched too tightly for casual talk, he gave me a nod like we were old enemies pretending at civility. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "I'm not here to accuse you," I said. He gave a hollow laugh. "That'd make a nice change." "I'm here to give you a choice." He sat, waited, hands folded too carefully. "Go on." "Wolfe believes your wife knew about Joseph's survival, briefly, that she preserved a message for him in the form of the glass and the wine. She didn't betray you. She honored something old. But now that gesture has been found, manipulated, and used to frighten you." He stared at me. "I know." That threw me for a second. "You knew?" I suspected. I'm not a fool. Joseph didn't just vanish. He had help. "You suspected Lorna?" "No," he said. "I suspected everyone. That's what he left behind. Paranoia. He had a gift for it." I gave him a second to breathe. "Here's the offer," I said. "You can let the myth unravel. Let rumors of Hensley's return float, unchecked. Let Genevieve and Vale and whoever else interpret the past however they like. Or," I leaned in, "you can define it. Own it. Tell the board Joseph is dead. That the wine glass was a sentimental relic. That Genevieve mourned him and poured a drink in his memory. That everything else is noise. You control the story." He swallowed. "And Wolfe?" "Wolfe will support your version." Quietly. Once. "Why?" "Because he'd rather you lead a lie that brings peace than let a truth that breeds war." Halberd looked away, eyes distant, scanning something only he could see. "There's no evidence?" "None that matters," I said. "The glass is stored. The cork is gone. Genevieve won't talk, not now. Vale is too calculated. Lorna wants closure. If you define it today, the rest will follow." He took a long breath, then nodded. "Tell Wolfe I accept." "No," I said. "You tell him yourself." That afternoon, Wolfe met with Grant alone in the office. I didn't sit in. Not because I wasn't curious, I always am, but because Wolfe preferred precision when maneuvering egos, and that kind of dance required space. The meeting lasted 21 minutes. When it ended, Halberd left quietly. No handshake, no farewell. Just a nod, tight, like a man accepting a crown he didn't ask for, but now had to wear. Later, I asked Wolfe what he'd said to him. I told him the story ends where he writes the period. Wolfe said, and that if he ever tries to erase it, I'll write the footnote. I laughed. That's poetic. It's preventative, Wolfe replied. And just like that, it was over. Officially, Joseph Hensley remained dead. The board accepted the narrative. Lorna hosted one last tasting and said nothing about fingerprints. Genevieve Maris returned to work, but didn't attend meetings for a week. Vale began grooming his successor. And Wolfe? Wolfe never mentioned the glass again. But 2 weeks later, Fritz received an unmarked package. Inside was a single bottle of Pavé de Cesse 2010. No note, no sender. I showed it to Wolfe. He took it in hand, examined the label, and placed it carefully in the cabinet without a word. You think it was from him? I asked. I think, Wolfe said, it was from someone who knows what silence costs. He didn't open the bottle. He never intended to. Somewhere out there, Joseph Hensley, real or remembered, had played his last move. And Wolfe, seated behind his desk, had played the board better. 2 days after the bottle arrived, Wolfe resumed his routines with the kind of precision only he could make feel ceremonial. Breakfast at 9, orchids until 11, a lunch of duck confit, followed by exactly 16 minutes of silence with his beer. I could almost believe the case was gone from his mind, filed away in whatever cerebral vault he kept for the solved and unspeakable. But I knew better. He hadn't touched the bottle. It sat in the cabinet, unopened, nestled between a 2005 Saint-Emilion and a 1994 Burgundy Wolfe wouldn't serve even to a bishop. The Pavé de Cesse was there for presence, not pleasure, like a monument or a warning. I spent the afternoon reviewing my notes, trying to understand what hadn't been said. Wolfe had settled the external world, given Grant Halberd a story to wield, protected Lorna, quieted Maris and Vale. The firm would go on. Leadership stabilized, the myth of Hensley intact, maybe even reinforced. But something still creaked beneath it, some detail Wolfe hadn't vocalized. Around 5, I found him in the office chair, hands steepled beneath his chin, eyes closed. I was about to speak when he said, "You've missed the final deception." I paused. "Which one?" "The simplest one," he murmured. "The one left unspoken because everyone feared its shape." I didn't sit. "You think he wasn't alive?" "No," Wolfe said. "I think he was." "Then what are we missing?" He opened his eyes and looked at me, not impatiently, but with the weariness of a man explaining rain to someone already wet. "Why did Joseph vanish, Archie? Why fake his death? Why involve Lorna, leave messages for Genevieve, and warn against Vale?" "Because he was scared." "Yes, but of what?" I frowned. "Corporate treachery? A financial threat?" Wolfe shook his head slowly. "That is too narrow. He could have handled that from a boardroom. He had leverage. No, Joseph disappeared because he feared exposure, not just sabotage." I crossed my arms. "You're suggesting he did something worth hiding?" "I'm suggesting," Wolfe said, "that someone else discovered it and gave him an ultimatum: disappear or be destroyed." I ran the possibilities. "Vale? Number Vale doesn't deal in ultimatums. He sharpens rules until they bleed." "Genevieve?" She would have leveraged it to rise, not erase. I let the silence fall again, and then I saw it, exactly as Wolfe meant me to. Lorna? Wolfe nodded. She said she hadn't seen Joseph for 6 months. But she also said she believed he'd contacted her. She preserved the glass, protected it, but she never asked questions, never pushed. Why? She knew more than she said. She chose not to say, Wolfe corrected, which means her silence wasn't fear, it was defense. I let that sit. So Joseph wronged her. Not Vale, not Genevieve, Lorna. Yes. Then why help him vanish? Wolfe leaned forward. Because she didn't want a scandal, or a suicide, or a headline. She wanted closure without collapse. And Joseph gave it to her, on her terms. He left. But she kept the wine glass as her tether. Not to him, to the truth. I exhaled. You think he hurt her personally? I think, Wolfe said, he betrayed her trust. Perhaps an affair, perhaps something worse. She didn't retaliate. She edited. That is far more dangerous. I sat down, slowly. So, why show me the glass? She didn't, Wolfe said. Someone else did. Someone who found her secret. Vale? Most likely. He suspected something, searched her space, and found the hidden clue. Then he placed it back where it would be found, not to expose Joseph, but to pressure Lorna, to see if she'd break. And she didn't. No, Wolfe said, because she no longer feared the myth. She owned it. That was the final move. Not by Wolfe, not by Hensley, but by Lorna. Quiet, enduring, and absolute. So what now? I asked. Now? Wolfe settled back. Now we allow the myth to settle, because the myth is safer than the man. I nodded. It made sense. The firm would move forward. The board would remember Hensley as a visionary. The story, edited and endorsed, would harden into legacy. Still, something tugged at me. The bottle, I said. Yes? You said it was a message. It was. From Lorna? No. He stood slowly, walked to the cabinet and opened it. It was from someone who wanted us to believe it was from Joseph. But it wasn't. I blinked. You're sure? Absolutely. Wolfe reached into the bottle rack and turned it ever so slightly. The cork had never been removed. The label glue is modern. The seal was too clean. This isn't a bottle from Hensley's cellar. It was placed, recently, as a decoy. Why? To test our story, Wolfe said. To see if we'd break it. Who would do that? Vale, he said. Or someone on the board, someone still unsure. I exhaled. They're still digging. Yes, Wolfe said. But they'll find nothing. Because we've handed them what they needed most. Which was? A story they can repeat without consequence. Wolfe returned to his chair, reached for his beer, and drank in silence. I sat across from him, looking at the sealed bottle in the cabinet. Untouched, unopened, still holding every question we hadn't dared to ask aloud. As I stood to leave the office, Wolfe spoke again, softly, almost as if to himself. There is no justice in a glass of wine, Archie. Only memory. And we are often drunk on the wrong ones. I paused in the doorway. You're not going to open it? Not even out of curiosity? No, Wolfe said. It was never meant to be opened. And I understood. Some stories don't end. They steep. They sit on shelves, or behind locked doors, or in the mind of a woman who chose quiet over chaos, who saw the truth and rewrote it, not to deceive, but to protect. That was the last case Joseph Hensley ever gave us. And Wolfe solved it without ever leaving his chair. The following morning was cold, clear, and unusually still for Manhattan. The kind of air that makes everything feel closer and more certain, whether it is or not. Wolfe took breakfast upstairs in the plant rooms, refusing to discuss anything beyond eggs and orchid humidity, while I filed the final notes, copied transcripts, and made sure the last loose ends were not tied off exactly, but folded neatly under the rug where civilized people don't look. It was after 11 when he came down, freshly shaven and still smelling faintly of clove. I was at my desk when he settled into his chair with the weight of someone who had completed a season, not a case. "You didn't sleep," I said. "I was thinking," he replied. "About Hensley?" "No." Wolfe reached for a folder and flicked it open. "About Lorna." That caught me. I turned in my chair. "What about her?" "She orchestrated something delicate," Wolfe said. "Something few people attempt and even fewer survive. She rewrote a man's death while protecting his shame and her own dignity. That, Archie, is not cowardice. It is an act of quiet genius." I didn't argue. "She never said what Joseph did," I offered. "We guessed. But she never said." "She didn't need to," Wolfe said. Her silence was the most credible evidence in the room. It carried weight no confession could duplicate. "Do you think she still loves him?" Wolfe looked out the window, considering. "Love, when wounded deeply, does not always die. It molts. It becomes something else. She may not love the man, but she honors the version she believed in." "And Halbert?" I asked. He accepted the narrative. "But how long will it last?" "As long as he needs it to," Wolfe said. The story was never about truth. It was about stability, control. In a world where evidence can be interpreted, perception is power. I smiled. "That sounds like something you'd write on a wine bottle." He gave me a rare look of approval. "Yes, which is why I never will." We sat quietly for a moment, the city humming softly beyond the windows. Wolfe broke the stillness first. "Do you know what bothers me most?" he said. I shook my head. "That the fingerprints were real." He looked at the corner cabinet, where the bottle still sat untouched. "Joseph was alive, at least for a while. That much we know. And then he vanished again, by choice or by force. We may never know which. But his prints were fresh, recent, undeniable. So either he returned," I said, "or someone made sure we thought he did." "Both," Wolfe said. "Both are true. That's the genius of it." I stood, stretched, and started toward the kitchen, then paused at the door. "So what now?" Wolfe opened a book, The Nature of Deception in Political Structures, and did not look up as he said, "Now we wait. Because someone else will knock. And when they do, we will know whether it is Joseph or his echo." I left him there, surrounded by books and calm, the architect of yet another invisible victory. No trial, no arrest, no confession. Just truth carved into silence and sealed inside a wine bottle no one dared open. In the end, Wolfe had solved what mattered. Not who lived or died, but who controlled what those lives meant afterward. And me, I'll remember the wine glass. 2 fingerprints. One vanished, one denied. Both unforgettable, 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 both